What happens when a Grandmaster tries to intimidate a quiet woman, completely unaware she's a chess genius? It was a bright, bustling morning in Chicago. The streets were filled with people going about their daily business, oblivious to the extraordinary events taking place inside the Chicago Chess Club. Richard Blackwell, the world-renowned Grandmaster, walked through the club's entrance, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. This was no ordinary day. It was the day of the most prestigious chess tournament of the year, the very tournament that had earned him a reputation as one of the most feared players in the world. At 58, Richard had spent over 3 decades cementing his dominance in the chess world. His name was whispered with reverence in the halls of chess clubs and tournament venues across the globe. His face adorned the covers of chess magazines, his strategies studied in chess schools, and his games analyzed by the best minds in the world. Richard Blackwell was not just a grandmaster, he was an icon, an undisputed champion who had crushed countless opponents with precision and psychological warfare. But today, Richard was about to meet someone who would shatter everything he thought. He knew about chess. As he entered the Chicago Chess Club, Richard surveyed the room with the sharp eyes of a predator. He recognized most of the faces around him, familiar challengers who showed up to these tournaments year after year, hoping for a shot at glory. His eyes scanned the crowd as he mentally cataloged the threats and non-threats. None of them mattered. He thought, he'd been through worse, and today victory was assured. It was just a matter of clearing the path. What Richard didn't expect was Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was a woman in her mid-30s who had just walked into the tournament with no plans of making a splash. In fact, she wasn't even sure she belonged there. She had never played in a competitive tournament before, and chess had always been a personal game for her, something she shared with her late grandfather. A librarian by day, Sarah lived a quiet, uneventful life, blending into the background as much as possible. She never sought attention, and she certainly didn't expect to receive any today. Her appearance was humble, her brown hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, her outfit consisting of a cream-colored cardigan and a pair of soft shoes. She seemed almost invisible in the midst of the men who filled the club. Their suits, their postures, their conversations about famous games, they all made her feel like an outsider. Chess, for her, had never been about status or public recognition. It was about the game itself, about the intimate moments spent playing with her grandfather, learning from him. Sarah had arrived at the club with the intention of attending a community chess workshop. She had seen a flyer at the library and thought it would be a good way to pass some time. But when she walked into the club, the receptionist greeted her and informed her that the event she had walked into was actually a championship qualifier. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A championship? She asked, a bit bewildered. She had never participated in anything of the sort. Yes, ma'am, but you know what? We always welcome new players. The entry fee is waived for today. Feel free to join us, the receptionist said with a warm smile. Sarah hesitated. A championship? This wasn't what she had envisioned. She had always played chess casually, never in a tournament. But something within her stirred a familiar feeling, a memory of her grandfather's soft voice guiding her through the rules. She agreed to join, though part of her felt out of place in this world of highly competitive players. Sarah had spent most of her life quietly learning chess with her grandfather. Every evening, after her shift at the library, they would sit together at his worn wooden table, moving pieces across the board until midnight. The nights were filled with laughter, patience, and the sound of chess pieces clinking together. Chess wasn't just a game for them. It was a ritual, an unspoken bond between them. Her grandfather had always taught her that chess wasn't about winning or losing, but about understanding the beauty of the game, about seeing things others couldn't see. You're my little sparrow, he'd often say, his weathered hands guiding hers over the board. Quiet and small, but you have the power to see what others can't. Never forget that. Sarah smiled faintly at the memory as she stepped into the tournament area. She felt a pang of sadness. Her grandfather was no longer with her, but his teachings remained firmly rooted in her heart. The first few rounds passed without much drama. Sarah's quiet demeanor and precise play were enough to catch the attention of her fellow competitors. Her first opponent, Tom, a friendly man in his 40s, had been nervous, admitting that it was his first tournament. As they played, Tom tried to make light conversation. But Sarah's concentration was absolute. She had learned long ago that chess was a story. Each piece on the board told a tale, a story of strategy, of cunning, of movement. Her grandfather had taught her that the best players didn't just play the pieces. They played the story. With every game, Sarah's confidence grew. She moved through the rounds, never flashy, never drawing attention to herself. But her victory spoke louder than any boast could. She moved steadily, methodically, as if the game was unfolding in front of her like an old friend she had known for years, Richard Blackwell. Meanwhile, made his way through the early rounds of the tournament with his usual ruthlessness. He crushed opponents with calculated precision, never hesitating to remind them of his legendary status. His reputation preceded him, and he used it to his advantage. Opponents often seemed intimidated before the game even began, and Richard didn't mind it. He had spent decades refining his ability to break his opponents mentally before the first move was even made. But then, in the third round, something caught his eye. At table 12, where the less experienced players were sitting, Richard saw Sarah again. She was playing against another opponent, a middle-aged man who was clearly no match for her. Richard watched from across the room as Sarah made her moves calm, precise, and effortless. Richard had seen many players in his time, but Sarah's play was unlike anything he had witnessed before. Her moves were smooth, but they were calculated, each one building on the next. This was no beginner's game. His curiosity piqued. Richard moved closer to the table. Interesting, he muttered to himself. Sarah had won yet another match, and her opponent looked absolutely baffled. Richard had seen many players in his career, but Sarah's play was different. There was a certain elegance to it, a subtlety that reminded him of the greats, the masters he had studied so deeply throughout his career. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't dramatic, she just played chess, and most importantly, she played it well. Richard wasn't sure what to make of it. She didn't look like a threat. In fact, she looked ordinary, almost out of place in the tournament, but her play was different. It had depth. It had understanding. It had something he had almost forgotten, true love for the game. As Richard made his way through the tournament, defeating opponent after opponent, he couldn't shake the image of Sarah at table 12. She was still there, still winning, still playing like a master. He had to know what was going on. Who was this woman? Richard's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his next opponent's voice. He refocused, turning his attention back to the game at hand. But as the rounds progressed, a small part of his mind lingered on Sarah Mitchell. Each time he looked over, she was there, still advancing. It was as if she were a ghost moving through the tournament. Unnoticed but undeniably powerful, Richard didn't know it yet, but his encounter with Sarah was about to set him on a path. He had never imagined a path that would challenge everything he knew about chess, about competition, and about himself. By the time the fourth round arrived, the whispers about Sarah Mitchell had already spread through the chess club. Who is she? Someone whispered, their voice filled with disbelief. Where did she come from? Sarah's quiet victories had made her something of a mystery. There she was, a librarian with no competitive background, advancing through a field of seasoned players like a shadow. She didn't speak much. She didn't draw attention to herself. But her moves were brilliant, methodical, and precise. Her opponents could barely understand what had happened when they lost. They didn't know what they had been up against, but it wasn't just Sarah's play that was catching the attention of the seasoned players. It was the fact that she wasn't intimidated. She wasn't daunted by the reputation of the Grandmasters who surrounded her. In a room full of men dressed in expensive suits, discussing famous games and players, Sarah remained serene, playing her game with the same quiet focus she had learned from her grandfather, Richard Blackwell. The chess legend watched from afar. His interest piqued. Sarah's progress had been steady, but it was her calm, almost stoic demeanor that intrigued him. Most players would have been nervous, shaken by the pressure of a championship tournament. But not Sarah. She was different. By the time they reached the semifinals, Richard had made his way through his section of the tournament with the same ruthlessness he had used for decades. He was known for his psychological tactics, his ability to break opponents before the first move had even been made. He had studied his opponents carefully, identified their weaknesses, and exploited them with precision. But Sarah was different. Richard couldn't figure her out. She wasn't like the others. Her play was too elegant, too refined for someone who had never participated in a tournament before. As the semifinals approached, the air in the chess club grew tense. The final match would be a showdown between Richard Blackwell, the undisputed champion, and Sarah Mitchell, the quiet librarian who had stunned everyone with her tactical brilliance. Richard couldn't help but feel a strange sense of curiosity. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering about his opponent. Who was she? Where did she come from? And how was it possible that someone with no tournament experience could play with such depth and understanding? When the pair sat down to play, Richard was calm, collected, at least on the surface. He had been here before. He had faced grandmasters, legends, and challengers who had tried to dethrone him. But this was different. The game between him and Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a game of chess. It was a battle of wills, a clash of two opposing philosophies about what chess truly was. Richard tried to break her. He used his usual psychological tactics, speaking to her in a voice meant to unsettle, meant to throw her off balance. "I've been playing tournament chess since before you were born," he said, his voice low and controlled. 33 years of competition, over 2,000 rated games. What's your experience level again? "This is my first tournament, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady, her hands gracefully moving the pieces on the board. Richard raised an eyebrow. "First tournament? Interesting." He leaned in, ready to make his move, but Sarah wasn't intimidated. She made her move calmly, confidently. Richard expected her to falter, to second-guess herself, but instead she played with a quiet understanding that seemed to frustrate him. Every move she made was thoughtful, precise. She wasn't intimidated by his reputation. She wasn't swayed by his words. She just played chess. As the game progressed, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. He found himself questioning his own moves, his own strategies. His usual psychological pressure was failing to have the desired effect on Sarah. She remained calm, poised, as if the game was unfolding exactly as it should. By the 20th move, Richard began to realize something he hadn't anticipated. Sarah wasn't just holding her own, she was outplaying him. Her position was solid. Her pieces were coordinated. She was playing chess in a way that reminded Richard of the great positional players of the past, the masters who could strangle their opponents slowly, subtly, until they didn't even realize they were losing until it was too late. And then it hit him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be in this position. He had played hundreds of games against the best players in the world. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just another challenger. She was someone who understood chess at a fundamental level that he hadn't seen in years. As the game progressed, Richard Blackwell could feel the shift, the weight of the match starting to take its toll. For the first time in decades, he was struggling. His moves, once executed with the speed and precision of a master, now seemed hesitant. His mind, usually sharp and unflinching, was now clouded with doubt. Every time he made a move, Sarah Mitchell's response seemed to be the perfect counter. It wasn't just her moves, it was the way she played. There was no flash, no overconfidence, no grand gestures. She played like she was inside the game, as if every piece on the board had a purpose, a story to tell. She wasn't just moving pieces. She was guiding them, orchestrating them like a symphony of strategy and calculation. Richard had always prided himself on his ability to read opponents, to understand their psychology and manipulate their confidence. He had used this skill to dismantle players mentally before they even began their games. But Sarah wasn't playing that game. She wasn't fazed by his attempts to throw her off balance. Instead, she simply played chess. By move 25, Richard realized something he hadn't expected. He was losing, not just in the game, but in his own mind. Every time Sarah made a move, it felt like she was pushing him further into a corner. Her calmness, her focus, her sheer understanding of the game, it was too much for him. He wasn't just losing the game, he was losing the battle he had always fought with himself, his ego, his reputation, his status as the invincible Grandmaster. Sarah's next move was subtle but devastating. She had positioned her pieces so that Richard's king had nowhere to go. Every move he made to escape was met with an even tighter net of control. It was the kind of chess Richard had once played himself, the kind that left the opponent with no room to breathe, no escape route. But now it was his own game being turned against him. He sat back in his chair, the crowd of spectators around them growing in size as word of their match spread. Richard felt their eyes on him, but it wasn't the usual feeling of admiration he was accustomed to. It was something else, something he had never felt before. Was it pity? Was it disbelief? For the first time he felt vulnerable. He felt like an imposter sitting across from this quiet woman who had so thoroughly outplayed him. In the audience, murmurs spread like wildfire. Is Blackwell losing? To her? I can't believe it. She's just ... playing circles around him. Sarah, for her part, remained composed, her hands moving with serene confidence. Her eyes flickered occasionally to Richard, but her focus was always on the game. The game, after all, was all that mattered. Richard glanced up at the clock on the wall, his mind racing. He needed to make a move. Any move. But every idea he entertained seemed to only worsen his position. Sarah had anticipated every possible outcome, every escape route, every trap. It was like she had read his mind before he even made the move. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His mind was in turmoil. He needed a moment. Just a moment to clear his thoughts, to regain some semblance of control. I need a moment, Richard muttered, more to himself than anyone else as he walked away from the board. His eyes scanned the refreshment table, his thoughts chaotic as they spiraled in every direction. He was a Grandmaster. He had beaten legends. He had bested players far stronger than any of those sitting around him now. And yet here he was struggling against a librarian who had never even played in a tournament before today. The silence that followed Richard's abrupt departure was deafening. The room had fallen into an uncomfortable stillness. Spectators whispered amongst themselves, eyes darting from Richard to Sarah, from Sarah to the board. They couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Sarah, however, remained unmoved by the spectacle. She knew this game was about more than just winning. It was about understanding, about listening to what the pieces were telling her. Her grandfather had taught her that. He had always said, "Chess isn't about defeating your opponent, little sparrow. It's about understanding the beauty of the game itself. To see what others cannot, to play with grace, and to learn the stories within the moves." The words echoed in her mind as she watched Richard walk away. She didn't pity him. She didn't even feel anger or frustration. She simply played, each move a quiet answer to the questions posed by the chessboard. As Richard returned to the table, he tried to mask the unease that had overtaken him. He sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his pieces. The familiar rush of confidence that usually accompanied him during these moments had evaporated. In its place, a creeping doubt had taken root, one that he couldn't shake. He was no longer in control of this game. He was no longer in control of himself. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, a small, unconscious gesture to calm his nerves. He glanced at Sarah, who was still sitting with an air of quiet confidence, waiting for him to make his move. "Very well," Richard said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Let's finish this." Sarah didn't respond. She simply nodded, her fingers delicately shifting one of her pawns forward. The move was elegant, simple, and yet, in that single move, Richard felt the walls closing in on him. It wasn't a grand play. It was a quiet, precise move that left him with only one real option, a move that would ultimately lead him into a dead-end position. The game had become a chess lesson. For Sarah, it was a chance to show the true art of the game, to demonstrate the beauty of simplicity and precision. For Richard, it was a moment of reckoning. He realized that he had spent too long focusing on psychological tactics, on breaking his opponents mentally, rather than truly understanding the game at its core. Richard's next move came hesitantly. He had hoped to shift the game back in his favor, but it was too late. Sarah's next response was swift and decisive. She sacrificed a piece in a move so elegantly executed that Richard could only stare at the board in stunned silence. It was a move straight out of the books of the chess legends. He had once idolized something Capablanca. Or maybe Petrosian would have done. Checkmate, Sarah said softly, her voice calm but filled with quiet certainty. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. He looked at the board, then back at Sarah. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been outplayed by a woman who had never competed in a tournament before today. His legendary streak had ended, and he had no words for it. For the first time in his life, the great Richard Blackwell was defeated. As Sarah Mitchell stood from the chessboard, the weight of the moment settled around her like a quiet storm. The room had gone eerily silent. Raced. This was the moment she had imagined countless times in the quiet of her library, but never had she imagined it would come to fruition in such a way. Richard Blackwell had been her idol for as long as she could. Remember, his games were studied by chess enthusiasts across the world. His calm, calculating demeanor had been a blueprint for generations of players. To have him across from her, to have defeated him, was beyond anything she had imagined. But it was not about defeating him. It was about playing the game with honesty, with pure understanding of its beauty. Her hands shook slightly as she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, trying to steady herself. She had spent years preparing for this moment, not in a tournament hall, but in the solitude of her grandfather's home, playing endless games with him, studying his old notes, and diving into chess theory from his forgotten library. Now, standing in the middle of the grand tournament hall, it felt like everything had come full circle. As she walked away from the table, the crowd parted before her. She felt the eyes of everyone in the room following her, their stares heavy with astonishment, disbelief, and awe. She had never been one for attention, never sought to be in the spotlight. But now she felt the eyes on her. She couldn't ignore them. Her footsteps, light yet purposeful, echoed in her ears. Her body was calm, but her mind was racing. She had done it. She had won. The whispers around her were like a storm slowly building. Did Blackwell really just lose? She's a beginner. This ... this is impossible. I've never seen anything like it. Where did she come from? A librarian? How could she play like that? The murmurs weren't malicious, but they were overwhelming. Sarah's focus, however, remained unwavering. She had always known that her grandfather had taught her something special, something beyond the games themselves. Chess, to him, had never been just about winning. It was about seeing what others couldn't, understanding the art of the game, the beauty and complexity of it. The way the pieces moved in harmony, the way one could tell a story through strategic placement and sacrifice. The knowledge he had imparted to her wasn't just technical. It was something deeper, something more intuitive. And now, here she was, playing the game exactly the way he had taught her. But as Sarah sat down on a nearby bench, away from the game, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Her grandfather had never cared about titles, trophies, or public recognition. He had simply wanted to share his love for the game with her. Now, in this bustling tournament hall, she felt disconnected from it all. The crowd, the whispers, the players, none of it mattered. It wasn't about the attention, and it wasn't about proving anything. Chess was about the game itself. Richard Blackwell, meanwhile, remained seated at the table. His mind raced. His hand, once so steady and unshakable, trembled slightly as he reached for his king. He had been the undisputed champion for years, a figurehead in the world of chess. His name was synonymous with victory, with ruthless efficiency. And now, in the space of one game, it had all unraveled. Richard had faced many formidable opponents in his life, but none had made him feel the way Sarah Mitchell had. He had been beaten before, of course. Every champion had lost a match here and there, but this was different. This wasn't just a loss, it was a blow to his very identity. It wasn't just about the game. It was about the reputation he had spent years building. The confidence, the respect, the fear that he commanded all of it was now in question. He sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the board, the pieces still in place. The game was over, but he wasn't ready to accept that. He had never felt such uncertainty in all his years of playing. His usual methodical mind, which had dissected thousands of positions with ease, now felt muddled. His gaze shifted back to Sarah, who sat across the room, her posture unassuming, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was the calm in the storm, while Richard felt like a ship lost at sea. Marcus Webb, the tournament director, approached Richard's table, standing hesitantly. Richard didn't look up at first, his thoughts too tangled. He was a Grandmaster, and yet, in this moment, he felt like a beginner. "Mr. Blackwell?" Marcus's voice was quiet, almost tentative. "Are you okay?" Richard glanced up at him slowly, his eyes tired but still sharp. "I've been defeated," he said quietly. "I can't understand how." Marcus didn't speak immediately. His eyes shifted to Sarah, who was still seated across the room, her attention now directed elsewhere. "I think I can help explain it, Richard." Richard's gaze followed Marcus's, his eyes landing on Sarah. "Her? She's just librarian, isn't she?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, she is. But her grandfather was James Mitchell, one of the most talented American chess players of his time." Richard blinked, surprised. "James Mitchell? The one who vanished from the chess scene in the 70s? "The very same," Marcus confirmed. "What you saw today wasn't beginner's luck, Richard. It was the legacy of someone who understood the game at a deep level. Sarah's been learning from his old books, his old notes. She's studied his games." Richard's mind began to shift as the truth sank in. James Mitchell, the man who could have been world champion, but chose a different path. He had disappeared without a trace, but his teachings had lived on through Sarah. Richard had heard whispers of Mitchell's brilliance, but he had never seen it. He had never fully understood what had been lost when Mitchell stepped away from competitive chess. Now he realized that the legacy was alive and well, and it had manifested in Sarah. A deep, almost sorrowful understanding began to settle in Richard. Sarah had outplayed him, but not in the way he had expected. She had outplayed him by playing the game for what it truly was. Not a battlefield, but an art form. The realization hit him hard. He had spent his career dominating, using psychological warfare to break his opponents before they could even begin. He had reduced chess to a series of tactical moves, a game of pressure and intimidation. But Sarah had played differently. She had played the way it was meant to be played. She had understood chess at its core, at its most pure and beautiful level, and in that understanding she had defeated him. Richard stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The crowd, which had gathered around him, murmured as he turned to face Sarah, who had now stood and was walking away from the tournament. "Aria." He had one last thing to say to her, one last moment to accept what had happened. He approached Sarah, who looked up at him as he drew near. For a moment, they simply stood there in silence. Richard was no longer the Grandmaster, the figurehead of the chess world. In this moment, he was just a man who had learned something from a quiet librarian, who had never once let her ego get in the way of the game. I owe you an apology," Richard said, his voice soft, genuine. "I tried to diminish you before we even began playing. I thought I could intimidate you, break you down mentally. That was wrong of me. You've shown me that chess is about something more than winning." Sarah's expression was calm, but there was a warmth in her eyes as she met his gaze. "My grandfather always said that chess teaches us who we really are. Maybe that's why he loved it so much." Richard nodded slowly. For the first time in his life, he understood what she meant. Chess was a reflection of the soul, a way of understanding not just the opponent, but oneself. As Sarah walked toward the preparation area for the final round, Richard stayed behind, still standing at the table. He looked at the board, at the position that had ultimately led to his defeat. The pieces, once so familiar, now seemed like they held a secret one that he had overlooked for years. Richard had been so focused on winning, on maintaining his control over every game, that he had missed the deeper meaning. The game wasn't about dominance. It was about understanding the beauty, the strategy, and the stories that each move told. And now, in his defeat, Richard felt a humility that he hadn't known in decades. As Sarah stepped onto the stage for the final round, Richard remained at the table, quietly studying the game once more. He had lost to Sarah, but in that loss, he had gained something far more valuable: and understanding of the true spirit of the game. "Good luck in the final," Richard called to her, his voice sincere. "Though I suspect you won't need it." Sarah turned back, her expression calm but warm. She nodded politely but said nothing. Her journey had just begun, but she had already proved that sometimes the quietest voices spoke the loudest.